wanted to show you guys this short video from Gilliam Pack. This is a friend of mine who goes out in Ukraine and films with Ukrainian soldiers, talks to them about their everyday experiences. And he spent a day with the 56th Brigade, which was operating a 120 millimeter mortar in the Bakhmut area. I don't know exactly where around Bakhmut, but in the general Bakhmut area. When they were asked how many shells they fire a day, one of the 24-year-old soldiers by the name of Fritz responded saying, "It would be easy to tell you how many we fire in a month. On average, about 2 or 3 a day." Now, I know Gilliam has interviewed other soldiers that fire more mortars or fire more shells of a different caliber out of their larger guns, but what he's talking about here is a general trend that has not only been expressed by him, but has been expressed by many other reporters, and I can express it myself as well. When I was interviewing soldiers working artillery guns in Donetsk or with the counteroffensive, all of them fired at max, like I think the maximum amount, we're talking like 8 a day. But when I was with them, the team in Zaporozhye with the counteroffensive, it was 2. The team in Donetsk, it was 1. They fired a very small amount in the single digits. And this has been the general theme amongst many artillery crews, or most artillery crews, for a very long time now. Now, why are they firing so few shells? Well, it's a pretty simple answer. They simply don't have enough shells to fire anymore and are rationing. And they need to keep enough shells in case their positions are attacked by the Russians. If, they want to have a few cluster munitions here and a few shells here in case they're attacked so they can bomb them as they advance towards their position. And they need to keep shells so they have a supply going months and months and months into the future, since the war has no end in sight. Now, I have been writing an article for a very long time now with UPI, and I've been doing embeds with artillery crews. The article should be coming out in the near future. I keep trying to give estimates for when it's going to come out, but it always fails because I am a freelancer. I like releasing stuff independently. Once you get any type of publication involved, it becomes bureaucratic hell. Putting that to the side, while doing this research, what I found is that generally, amongst both the Russians and the Ukrainians, there's been a massive decrease in the amount of shells fired since the start of the war. For the Russians, they fired 10 to 11 million shells within the first few months of the war. Well, the first few months, I mean like the first 10 months. It's 2022. Now, when I say 2022, people think of a 12-month period, but remember, the war started in February, late February. So we're actually talking about a 10-month period that they fired about 1 million or a little bit more than 1 million shells per month. But eventually, the Russians started to run out of reserves. They started declaring old reserves that used to be declared unfit for use, that they weren't safe. They said, never mind, now they are fit for use. There's been a lot of coverage of the North Korean shells coming in for the Russians. The Russians are investing heavily into shell production to the point that I think they're spending about 6% of GDP on military spending, and now their military spending has outpaced their social spending. So the Russians are putting a lot of weight to try to increase their shell production, since they're simply using many more shells than they are producing, and they will only be able to dig out of their old Soviet reserves for so long. So the Russians have been trying to dig out into the reserves, and the Ukrainians have used basically up all of their reserves that they have. They've had a lot of their post-Soviet allies, we're talking like Poland and other post-Soviet states outside of Hungary, have taken all of their Soviet reserves, or most of their Soviet reserves. There's still some left that is accessible if we were to continue to pressure them, and gave them to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians also got more modern Western guns like the M77 howitzer, which uses 155 millimeter shells off of modern production lines to try to supplement their old Soviet models, which makes up the majority of their artillery guns, the majority of their artillery batteries. But these more modern shells and these old Soviet stockpiles from across Eastern Europe were simply not enough. The West kept looking for new resources. They got the South Koreans to transfer 500,000 shells to the United States to make more room so we can transfer more shells. America and many other European states are investing much more into shell production. But it's not enough. The Europeans said that they would be able to give Ukraine 1 million shells by the end of 2023. And we're about a month away, and they've only delivered 30 to 40% of the 1 million shells promised. They've been missing their estimates. They've been missing their commitments, and they've been unable to keep up with the need for shells in Ukraine. So, I wanted to emphasize this right now because this is the state of affairs on the ground. Russia and Ukraine both racing to increase their own shell production, looking overseas for any other shells they can bring in, because artillery guns and artillery batteries and rockets and anything that could be broadly labeled under artillery is the main killer and the main casualty causer in this war. From my interactions with Ukrainian medics and my conversations with them, multiple Ukrainian medics, all of them will tell me that the number one causer of injuries, the number one thing that is bringing about casualties is artillery and shrapnel from artillery. I've had that told to me by two medics in separate interviews, different medical journals where Western doctors have come over to try to review injuries have backed this up as well, that usually the number one thing that is injuring people is artillery. And I don't really even think this is debatable. I'm just trying to emphasize this because I can't find anything that says otherwise. So this is pretty universally agreed upon that artillery in a way is the backbone of the armed forces. And if your backbone is only able to fire 2 to 3 a day, when you know that that is what's causing 50 to 70% of your enemy's casualties, running out of ammunition for that weapon system is a major problem. And as the Ukrainians are scrambling and as the Russians are scrambling, the Ukrainians are running into a problem. And that is, quite frankly, while the Russians are ramming themselves against Avdiivka, taking massive casualties, trying to bust into the fortress city, I think that in the last 2 to 3 weeks, the estimate is they've lost over 9,000 soldiers, tons of armor, tons of tanks, and the Ukrainians are trying to use what resources they have to hold them back. As this state of affairs is going on, we have this race for artillery, the race for munitions, the Ukrainians trying to hold back the Russians at Avdiivka. Military aid is running out.
Burns is in.
The White House admits this. The White House doesn't just admit this, they've been saying this for weeks and weeks and weeks. Actually, no, I think it's months now. That they are running out of money that they have for the Presidential Drawdown Authority. They're running out of munitions that they've allocated for Ukraine. And if Congress does not approve more aid, then they will not be able to send over more supplies to Ukraine. And that they're running out. Now, this lack of action is not because there is somebody in DC who thinks, oh, this war can, we can just put this war on hold or we can engage whenever. None of this is coming from a sit-down review of all the facts of the battlefield with them walking away saying, oh, we can get this to them 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months down the line. Everything will be okay. The decision to hold aid is not due to it becoming unpopular. This is something that I'm hearing a lot more, but I don't believe it. Because the majority of Americans are still in favor of aid. And not only are the majority of Americans still in favor of aid, the majority of people in Congress, elected congressmen, are in favor of aid. The majority of senators are in favor of aid, and the United States president is in favor of aid. It is legal. The sending of this aid is legal on the international stage. The UN would not, I don't know if the UN would come out and openly endorse sending weapons, but they would 100% uphold that Russia is committing the crime of aggression and Ukraine's allies has the right to send it weapons to defend itself. So everything here is above board, not only above board, but when it comes to foreign aid projects, relatively popular.
A curd is a curd.
Fuckle has donated $5.
I started learning Ukrainian because of you and your coverage de Kuu drug less than 3.
Thank you for the $5. I appreciate it. Hope you keep learning Ukrainian. And if the concern is, and this is the last thing I want to bring up, if the concern is, well, you know, we're just spending way too much money, which is the last concern, which I at least give the most credence, because I can at least understand from a bookkeeping aspect of, I'm fiscally conservative and need to make sure everything is above the book. I can understand that at the very least. But when you compare the $75 billion in military aid that we've sent to the $8 trillion we spent in Iraq and Afghanistan, to get much more of a result here, we've liberated over 50% of the territory that the Russians have captured since February 2022. We have seen the only provincial capital that the Russians captured liberated in Kherson, a city of 600,000 people. We've seen what was supposedly the second most powerful military in the world have to fight head to head, shoulder to shoulder against the Ukrainians and be held. It's not a situation where in every battle the Ukrainians are pulling back and holding off and just trying to cause as many casualties as possible. The Russians are, in many instances, unable to hold the Ukrainians back and unable to take Ukrainian positions. The Russians have been forced to recognize that the Ukrainians are a fighting force that are willing to stand up for their own country and that they're not invincible. And in those early days and how they marched on Kiev and marched on Kharkiv and marched on all the major cities, oh, how they thought they were invincible in the way they behaved. That is a lesson they've had to learn very, very, very brutally. So why is it that this aid is being upheld? Well, I, number one, want to point to the American perception of foreign aid. There's been polling done, which I found absolutely fascinating, about not how much aid we actually send overseas, because we send maybe 1% of our budget on foreign aid. And we're talking about foreign aid, we're talking about aid generally. And so when we spend historically around 1% of our budget on military foreign aid, you get the idea. Not on military, but on military aid, stuff like that. You would get the idea, or you would get the impression that cutting this out isn't going to be what saves our economy. Cutting this out isn't what's going to, help fund rebuilding programs, or this isn't what's going to make or break the United States. You could talk about big tax cuts for corporations, or Trump's massive tax cuts, or you could talk about, maybe some sort of capital gains tax, or any other maneuvers or tools you could use to try to help balance the budget. But cutting the $75 billion that we've sent over 2 years, much of it not in actual funds, but in old equipment that we've been holding on to for 50 to 60 years, that is not even convertible into its original values that we're estimating them at. I don't think that's what's going to make or break the U.S. economy. But when you poll people on how much money is spent on foreign aid, and you ask them what they think it is, that means you don't show them any data, you just ask them from their general impressions, how much money do they think we spend on foreign aid? And they say about 20%. Which is, I think, 2,000 times greater than the actual percentile. And so if you think that we're spending 20% of our budget on aid, if you think we're spending that much, and then you just hear these numbers on the news, like 100 million for Ukraine, 200 million for Ukraine, 1.5 billion for Ukraine every few months, because we've been taking this drip approach to sending aid over there, well, that's going to leave an impression. Now, $100 million is a lot of dollars for you or for me or for maybe a small town. But when you're talking about holding up an army against the second most powerful military force in the world, and when you're talking about military aid, that's actually not a lot of money. Definitely if you're talking about something like the F-16 fighter program, which is going to be quite expensive to help the Ukrainians with, relative to what we've already sent them. 100 million in the grand scheme of things when you compare it to Iraq, Afghanistan, operations in the Middle East or Ukraine or anywhere. It's not that much, but if you hear it enough time and you have no frame of reference to hear that, oh, it's only about, we've only spent about 5% of Pentagon spending on Ukraine. Oh, it's about 0.5% or 0.4% of our GDP that we spent. When you don't have that relative,
morally corrupt,
when you don't have that relativity to measure it by, you just hear big number sent to Ukraine and you hear it every few months. And that's what creates, I think that's what helps to create, without that context, this impression that 20% of our budget is going towards aid, which is absolutely just make believe. It's unicorn land. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. I think part of the reason why the aid is being upheld, is being held up, is for that impression that many people have. And there have been polls done when talking to people and explaining what, you know, our aid has gained, what the percentage of our aid is relative to our military budget. When that information is introduced to people polled, we see 15 to 20 point jumps in support for aid to Ukraine. So I do think it's having a real substantive impact. And even with that misperception about how much money we spent on military aid or how much money we spent on aid, period, even with that misperception, we still have a majority of Americans who support aid. And I wanted to bring that up. So I think that's part of the reason why the aid is being upheld and why there's more opposition within primarily the Republican Party, is because of that perception. I do think, to some extent, another reason why is that Russia is not the typical American foreign policy opponent of the last 20 years, which was a lot easier for Republicans to rally around. So it was, saying that it's the Republican Party that is not, you know, cheery to send weapons to any of our allies is very strange when you're talking about that in the last few years. And this would be primarily constrained within like the Rand Paul and Ron Paul crowd. But as of recent, at least when Ukraine is concerned, this type of, this type of fiscal conservatism has become much more popular. And I think this has to do with a lot of it has to, amongst the more far right fringe of the party, has to do with the fact that some of them sympathize with the Russian invasion, either because they sympathize with the Russian government, even if they don't sympathize with the direct causes of the invasion,
morally corrupt, bankrupt man,
or they think that they have actually in some way fallen for Russian propaganda. And I think Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about Ukrainians engaging in organ harvesting is a great example. I think hearing other people questioning Mike Pence about the Ukrainians banning like Orthodox Christianity or the, you know, how based and red-pilled Russia is, I do think for a small fringe of the Republican Party, there is a certain amount of sympathy for the invading forces. Definitely when you're talking about people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is openly sympathizing with the invading forces and spreading their completely just unfactual propaganda about Ukrainians harvesting the organs of babies. So I think part of the reason it's being held up is because of a perception of aid being an overwhelming part of the American budget, and therefore it is undermining our ability to pay for things like universal health care or, you know, housing our veterans, which I do want to throw out there. Even if we were to stop all aid tomorrow, wouldn't house a single veteran, wouldn't bring it back about universal health care, would not end the drug war, would not achieve any of the policy priorities of either progressives or many of the critics of aid who want to see that money spent elsewhere. It's kind of hard to take a 1960s troop carrier, give it to a homeless person, and say that you've solved the housing crisis. So those are the two big reasons that I think are holding up aid for Ukraine. But the thing is, even if you see the situation and you're like, okay, so there's some people who are either finance hawks or believing they're being finance hawks for a much bigger issue, and you've got some people who are somewhat sympathetic, but that can't make up 50% of Congress, Dylan. So there must be something else that's holding it up. Well, the Speaker of the House is Mike Johnson. This is somebody who was elected Speaker of the House after rounds and rounds and rounds and rounds of back and forth within the Republican Party. And eventually he got elected with a very slim majority. because the Republicans have a very slim majority in the House. And because they have a very slim majority, they have to have a lot of party unity if they don't want to lose another House Speaker and look like they can't rule the House, and or have the Democrats take advantage of the situation. But there is a group of about 15 Congress people who were willing to sink Kevin McCarthy and sink many other congressional candidates for the speakership over aid to Ukraine and over compromises with the Democrats, which any Speaker of the House, if they want to get anything done with the Democrats controlling the Senate and the presidency, are going to have to come to compromises, or Joe Biden can either A, veto it, or B, it'll just be shot down in the Senate. But because of the fact that, you know, there's a lot of, I would say, political pressure not to work with Joe Biden. There now is a lot of pushback on sending aid to Ukraine from the more libertarian portions of the Republican Party. There are a lot of, I'm going to be honest, like disinformation being spread about Ukraine by people like Tucker Carlson, from people like RFK, that we've talked about on this channel before, that I do think is having a public perception on aid to Ukraine. For any number of reasons, there is enough Republicans in the House that don't want to support aid to Ukraine, that it makes it that even though the majority of the House and the majority of the Senate and the presidency has support for aid to Ukraine, that Mike Johnson has to listen to those radicals, or he risks having his speakership torn down, having another speaker election, throwing the House in the chaos again, not having a budget passed, and the Republicans looking like a massive den of clowns once again. And because that's the situation he's in, aid to Ukraine has kept getting kicked down the road again and again and again, because every compromise Mike Johnson tries to make with Joe Biden, which is, when I say compromise, it's how about we vote on everything I like and just take out the Ukraine aid. And then Joe Biden's like, nope. And then they kick down the can another week, another week, another week. And this has been the song and dance. And many people have been concerned that the song and dance is going to go on for so long that they're not going to be able to reach a budget. And that not only will there not be aid sent to Ukraine, which cannot plan its offensives without aid, cannot plan for the future without the aid being approved and them knowing that they're going to get these supplies so they can plan for future operations and use the gear that they have now more forthright, more willingly, and be more active with what they have now, knowing that aid is coming in the future. None of this can happen until the aid is approved. So we've been waiting, and we've been waiting, and we finally gotten a response from a Mr. Schumer that we're going to have a floor vote on Ukraine aid next week. We're going to have it on December 3rd. Let's read it. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said Sunday in a letter to his Democratic colleagues that he will bring a national security package to the floor that ties together Israel and Ukraine funding as soon as next week. One of the most important tasks we must finish is taking up and passing a funding bill to ensure that we, as well as our friends and partners in Ukraine, Israel, and the Indo-Pacific region, have the necessary military capabilities to confront and deter our adversaries and competitors. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, and House Speaker Mike Johnson have insisted that the GOP support for more Ukraine funding is contingent on tightening immigration laws and growing concerns about security at the U.S.-Mexican border. Now, I have a message from Mike Johnson here of him saying basically the same thing, with him also, and I do think this is a somewhat positive sign, saying that Ukraine is a priority.
Ukraine is another priority. Of course, we can't allow Vladimir Putin to march through Europe, and we understand the necessity of assisting there. What we've said is that if there is to be additional assistance to Ukraine, which most members of Congress believe is important, we have to also work in changing our own border policy. And so there's been a lot of thoughtful negotiation ongoing with that. I think most of our Senate colleagues recognize that those two things need to move together because we owe that to the American people. That's what they're demanding that we do.
They're not. I don't see the American people demanding, at least not on scale, saying until you address any other political issue, you have to close the border. I don't know that. There are people who are scared about the border. There are people who think that the border is an issue, but I don't know what intrinsically ties, you know, your transatlantic security, Europe being stable, making sure that the second largest holder of international reserve currency, the euro, is stable, making sure that our main export market is stable. I mean, these are not even, I'm not even getting into the morality of Ukrainian independence, Ukrainian sovereignty. These are just basic American national security and economic priorities, right? None of these things are necessarily directly tied to our southern border in really any fashion. These things, for all intents and purposes, are two separate issues. And so it feels like Mike Johnson is trying to find a way to justify to these radicals in his party voting in favor, or at least allowing a vote on Ukraine aid to happen in concession for some sort of reward, i.e. some sort of border funding. It feels like really like a sort of pork barrel politics. But what gets me about this the most is every single time there's a new standard drawn up for Ukraine aid, the American government meets it and the Ukrainian government meets it, and then the new standard just kind of shifts. Here's an example. For a while, I heard, I'm not going to approve another cent of Ukraine aid until an inspector general is approved so we can make sure that this military aid to Ukraine gets there and isn't funneled into the pockets of some oligarch. And I wasn't even necessarily opposed to it. But I also didn't necessarily think they were going to find much, but I wasn't opposed to it. And eventually it was approved. And I thought, well, you know what? There is some examples of corruption in Ukrainian society. People know that Ukraine has a problem with corruption. There's been examples of humanitarian aid being funneled off for people to try to make a profit off of it by selling on the streets. There have been military officials recently charged over illegally selling army food supplies. And they're good developments because people are being charged, which before people didn't used to be charged. But also it does show that it's still an issue. So I'm like, okay, an inspector general makes sense. I mean, humanitarian aid and food supplies is very different than a tank. It's kind of hard to sell a tank on a street corner for extra food money, for extra pocket money. A lot of times people have a cartoonish image of Ukrainian corruption in their mind, but whatever, we get to do it. We approve an inspector general. There's not a peep about it. And immediately the standard moves. Immediately the standard shifts. We have American senators and American congressmen come to Ukraine, try to inspect the process of how our aid is tracked, how our aid is used, come back, review it with flying colors. None of the standards move. We hear so often about Ukraine being a money laundering scheme, a money washing scheme, that it's all fake aid or whatever. But then every single time there's an attempt to find this fake aid or this money all being washed away, nothing comes up. And since that effort has failed, and since there's nowhere else to be moved on that effort, there's no new roadblock to put in the way to monitor aid, now it's, well, if you want to care about stopping Russia from conquering Ukraine and expanding their death pits, then you need to have more border guards. Again, two completely separate issues, but I doubt that Senator Schumer would be bringing a vote forward on Ukraine aid unless he had a general idea that it had a chance of success. I'm hoping that it does succeed on December 3rd, because if it doesn't, that means possibly months more of negotiations into January and February with no new aid approvals, meaning there could be a good month where we've basically just dried up on any aid to Ukraine. And we're just kind of living on a prayer that eventually the aid will get approved. Not because there isn't enough support in the House, not because there isn't enough support with the American people, not because there's not enough support in the Senate, and not because the president doesn't support it, but because Mike Johnson is too scared to bring it for a House vote because he has been held hostage by the radicals in his party, some of which sympathize with the Russian invasion. Anyway, that's enough of that.